Welcome to Eviliv, the live media commentary show that answers the question, are we ever going to see Gandalf again? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing The Fellowship of the Ring. Now, this is book 1 of The Lord of the Rings, and I've never read it before. I grew up reading science fiction and fantasy, and this is just one, it's like the original fantasy, and yet I had friends telling me I should read it, and I just never got around to it. A couple months back, I finally read The Hobbit, and so I figure if I'm going to read The Hobbit, I have to read the entire Lord of the Rings as well, and I'm going to be delving into the Silmarillion and some of the other stuff, because quite frankly, I think the lore is interesting. I think the world building is spectacular, and I'm curious. I watch shows like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and then we have The Hunt for Gollum coming up, and then of course we have the Rings of Power series in Amazon Prime that has, I think, only 2 seasons. I have to double check. I'd like there to be a third so I can see how everything sort of pans out. But I was stunned, just as initial thoughts on this, I was stunned at how much information this book actually gives you about the history. So all of the questions that I had during the Rings of Power were answered in this book. Like every one. Which blows my mind because there's people complaining about the Balrog being in Rings of Power, but that was talked about in this. People were freaking out about The Hunt for Gollum being a movie, but that was talked about in this. So, like, the lore is there. Like, it's all been explained in depth. And I was blown away by it, to be quite honest. So that's my initial thoughts. Chris, how you doing? It's a nice surprise you're working. Very cool. Haven't read this in a while. Interesting to hear the difference between this and the movies. The movies are very, very different. For dramatic effect. And let's be honest, there's some real downfalls of this novel. And it's not really this novel as much as it's J.R.R. Tolkien's writing. Everyone heralds him as being a great author, and he's a great world builder, but I don't think he's a very good writer. Especially when it comes to action sequences. He sucks. He's terrible at it. And that's why he doesn't do it very often. And even when you have these sort of moments that demand in-depth writing, he skips right past them so that he doesn't have to deal with the actual action in the story, which is really frustrating for someone who loves action in stories. So, of course, this is written by J.R.R. Tolkien. The series is The Lord of the Rings. The publisher originally was George Allen and Unwin, and it was published in 29 July 1954. Not very popular when it came out at all, but it found its audience, it found itself, and now it is beloved by anyone who loves storytelling, lore building, language development, poetry, songs, and fantasy in general. And understandably so. Hot take, Dragonlance Chronicles was better when you read both as a teen. I think so. I actually do think the Dragonlance Chronicles are better than, I'll say the action is better, The lore building, the world building in Tolkien's universe is infinitely better and more rich than in Dragonlance. But Dragonlance is a close second, I think. A close second. So I don't really have a lot of notes. I just kind of wanted to riff a little bit about this. As far as the sequence of events in this book, it starts in the Shire and it ends in Amon Law, where very similar to the first film, of course, because it's based off of the book, obviously. But there are some significant differences. There's a lot more combat in the film than there is actually in the book itself. Like a lot more. I remember someone mentioning once that the Eye of Sauron as presented in the film was not actually part of Tolkien's writing, and that's not true at all. That's actually in this book, the eye itself. It doesn't show up until the very end, like the third quarter of the novel, the third act, but it is in it. It talks about how Frodo sees it when he puts it on. And little things, just for example, when Frodo is actually stabbed with the Morgul blade and he's being slowly poisoned and turned into a ring wraith, Strider slash Aragorn races him off to ultimately be, rescued by, I'm looking for her name because it's evading me in the moment, Arwen. But that doesn't actually happen in the book at all. In fact, as Frodo is slowly dying, they go off on like days-long journeys because Strider slash Aragorn couldn't find the way to Rivendell. He had apparently forgotten how to get there, and so they were lost in the wilderness trying to find it. And it was actually, I'm looking at my notes here. Oh gosh, where was it? It was, did I not make a note for his name? I think it was Galdor. No, it wasn't Galdor. Elro here? Well, anyway, it wasn't Arwen that found them. It was another elf that was traveling the land, and then he ended up delivering them to Rivendell, and it was Gandalf, who was already in Rivendell, along with the other elves, that created that massive flood. And Gandalf actually made the little horses. He was very proud of that. The horse effect in the water that you see on a lot of the covers. Well, here, let me show you some of the covers here. And certainly it's an iconic moment in the film, that sort of penultimate moment at the end of the first book before you start the second book, where the river washes away the physical embodiment of the ringwraiths. And that scatters them so that they can no longer continue hunting. I'm probably like totally pissed off Sauron as well. It's like, how dare you sons of not learn how to swim? You don't know how to swim? So, okay, so the premise is, of course, Bilbo Baggins has been kicking it in the Shire, and he's having his 111th birthday, and it's also Frodo Baggins, his sort of surrogate son, if you will. He sort of adopted him. He's not even really a Baggins. Maybe, through some lineage, he eventually is. But basically, he lives with Bilbo, and they just sort of have their happy life. Bilbo's tired of living in the Shire. He wants to finish his book, and he wants to go on one last adventure. And so he has this big to-do, and ultimately, he then pops smoke, puts the ring on, and disappears back to Bag's End, his home, and then packs his stuff and gets the hell out. That's when he and Gandalf sort of have a come to Sauron moment, a come to Gandalf moment, because ultimately Bilbo wants to take his ring with him. He hasn't parted with it. It's the reason why he's had this longevity of life, but the ring belongs to Sauron, the Lord of the Rings, and he's trying to get it back. And one thing I thought was really interesting is that in the movie, it's presented as if Bilbo happens to stumble across the ring. In the book, it's actually said that the ring tried to leave Gollum, and that's how Bilbo stumbled across it, because the ring couldn't get anywhere with Gollum, and it was trying to find its way back to its maker, Sauron. And I just thought it's not a huge difference, but it's an important difference because it gives the ring autonomy, which means when you use the ring, it's reaching out to Sauron. It has an ego. It has intelligence. It has an id, if you will. And so it's an intelligent artifact. And that's a totally different presentation than just, this item of power that Sauron wants so that he can wield it. No. It wants to get back to Sauron. And that's sort of mentioned a little bit in the film, but it's not the same as it's the reason Bilbo found it, because it wanted to get the fuck out of the mountain that Gollum was under, and hence they left. So ultimately, Gandalf does a bunch of research about this ring, dreading that it might be that one ring, and then discovers it is in fact that one ring. And so he comes back to Bilbo. He's like, hey, look, good luck to you on your adventure, but you ain't taking that. That thing is killing you slowly, and it's turning you into Gollum. And he's like, how dare you? This is ridiculous. And then they have a whole big back and forth about it. Ultimately, he leaves it in a little envelope for Frodo. Frodo then comes, discovers that Bilbo has already left, and Gandalf says, hey, just hold on this for a while. A long time, months pass. Gandalf comes back and he's like, okay, I need you to check this out. And he like puts it in the fire and then he brings it out and ultimately says, this is the ring of power. This is something that it needs to be destroyed. And Frodo's just like, well, destroy it. And he's like, I can't do it. It has to go to Mount Doom. And Frodo's like, well, take it to Mount Doom. And he's like, I can't do it. We have to take it to someone smarter. We got to go to the elves. We've got to go to Elrond, the half elven. And what I thought was interesting about Elrond is he's a half elf. He's not a full elf. He's actually part elf, part man. And that's a very interesting framing as well, because he's sort of half in the real world and half out of it. Whereas all other elves live fully in the other world and in this world. There's like this, and they don't really frame it as like heaven or anything like that. It's just sort of like the other side or the other world, where elves came from. And so they sort of straddle these two worlds. And so when Frodo actually wears the ring, he sees elves as they are seen in the other world, as if they're almost angelic of sorts, which also is kind of an interesting dichotomy between heaven and hell, and elves leaving Earth to go back to heaven because Earth is turning into hell thanks to Sauron. Just a little bit of fun play there. The version I read is actually this covered version. My wife has had it for years, and it has J.R.R. Tolkien's sort of foreword about this series and how he's made some adjustments to his original story, very small stuff, but that everyone has always mentioned that this is supposed to be a parable in some way about the Great War that Tolkien lived through and fought in. And he said straight up, this is not about the war at all. This is just me, coming up with ideas. And some of them might have been inspired by that, but this is not about the World War at all. And I always thought that interesting, because all historians I've ever heard talking about Lord of the Rings, they're like, yes, this is definitely about the war. And no, it's not. From the author's own mouth, it is not. I found that very, very frustrating. Interesting. You always loved the idea that Gandalf recognized that he wouldn't be able to resist the ring's power, true wisdom, and recognize your own limitations, frailties. Yeah, for sure. And that's the other thing about Gandalf, is that the further you go in the lore, you realize Gandalf is way more powerful, way more powerful than anyone has suggested. I mean, everyone says they're wary of wizards and wizards go their own way and they do their own thing and they just have this incredible power. But Gandalf is like next level power, because he's like, look, if I use the ring, I would try to use it out of, a place of goodness, of whatever. But the ring doesn't let the individual using it decide what it does. It corrupts you so that you will then return it. So it wasn't that Gandalf was afraid of using the ring and becoming a horrible person. He was afraid that Sauron would use his power. He was like, look, if I use the ring, I'll get some of the power for a little while, but ultimately Sauron will get all of my power. And that would be even worse than what Sauron has with the ring. So that just tells you how incredibly powerful these very few wizards exist on Middle Earth, and how much power they wield, that they're infinitely powerful, more powerful than the ring itself, and that Sauron with their power would be like the end. There's nothing that could come back from that. That's inferred through Gandalf's fear. And that's nothing that I ever got from the film. Like, I just thought it corrupts you, and so you become a bad guy. But no, not at all. It just draws you back to Sauron, and then he gets your power if you have any. That's pretty cool. So ultimately, Gandalf realizes that he's got to get Frodo out of there. But it takes them months before they plan the actual journey to Rivendell. And in that time, Gandalf is trying to figure out, what the hell this ring is, right? That's where the hunt for Gollum comes in. Gandalf goes to Aragorn and he's like, hey, bro, I need your help to find this creature. His name was Smeagol. He's now sort of calling himself Gollum. He had this ring for a long time. Bilbo found him and took a ring from him. We need to find Gollum so that we can find out what this ring actually is. And so he goes with Aragorn. They capture Gollum. And Gandalf says straight up, I tortured this motherfucker. I'm paraphrasing, but I tortured him under fire and fury, and before he actually revealed the truth, because his mind was so twisted from the ring, he didn't want to admit that he had killed his friend in order to get the ring. And so he made up a bunch of lies about being a birthday present and stuff like that. But he finally got the truth out of it, and he realized the power of the ring. And that's what actually led him to the path of discovering that it is, in fact, the ring of power. And so he said, well, we can't let Gollum go anymore because he knows too much. He knows who has the ring. And if the enemy gets the ring, if Sauron gets Gollum, then he's going to find out where the ring is. So we have to keep him under wraps. And so Aragorn takes Gollum to Mirkwood, and Legolas and the Mirkwood elves actually hold on to Gollum for a while. But Gollum is so clever and so cunning that he ends up getting away from them. And that is then ultimately, it's sort of inferred how he gets captured by the enemy. And that's how the enemy finds out about where the ring is in the Shire under the hands of Baggins, Bilbo Baggins. So I just thought all of that information was not in the movie at all. You had no idea about any of it. And it's this wonderful backstory about this forthcoming film that's going to be all about what was just this one little info dump that Gandalf gave to Frodo to explain how he knew that it was, in fact, the One Ring. And that's fascinating to me as someone who just loves lore and history and stuff like that. It's just, I think it's really, really cool. See, you always love the idea of Gandalf recognized. Another common misconception is that Gandalf is a traditional D&D type wizard. He wasn't. He didn't cast spells. He was some sort of celestial being. Yeah. It's inferred that he is a wizard and powerful but mortal in this so far. But we had this foreshadowing moment ultimately when the Fellowship gets to Lothlorien and they meet with the elves there. They stare into the this sort of bowl of why did I not write down everyone's name? I should have wrote down everyone's damn name, because now Galadriel's bowl. But anyway, it's basically this fortune, like this sort of searing bowl, like a crystal ball. You could see the possible futures, possible pasts, and sometimes it comes to pass and sometimes it's just not. But anyway, when Frodo looks into it, he actually sees Gandalf as a white wizard walking past him, but he doesn't know it's Gandalf. It just sees a white wizard. And up to that point, we'd only been told about Saruman, who is also a wizard, sort of the leader of the wizard orders on Middle-earth that Gandalf sort of talks to. And confirms, his suspicion about the ring. But that's why he actually couldn't go back and go with Frodo in order to help him along his journey to get to Rivendell, because he was captured by Saruman. So once Gandalf got the information from Gollum, he went to Saruman, the leader of his order, who's Saruman the White, Saruman the Wise, and he's like, hey, dude, this is the Ring of Power. We got to do something about this. And Saruman the White is just like, yeah, I know. We got to use it, bitch. And so, there was no Palantir, and there was no him being corrupted by Sauron in the book. That was all in the movie. In the actual book, Saruman the White was just trying, and he was no longer Saruman the White, was my point of all this. He turned into Saruman of many colors, so that he was no longer pure. His ambition and desire twisted him up a little bit and changed his entire essence, as it were. And so he became Saruman of many colors, and he was like, look, if you want to come with me, let's go get that ring, but I'm going to use the ring, and you can be my bitch. Again, I'm paraphrasing. And we'll rule this whole Middle-earth together. And Gandalf was just like, yeah, I don't think so. I think maybe you're a bad person. And then he imprisons him there. So I thought that was interesting, because it's a totally different framing of Saruman from being an agent of Sauron into just wanting to get the ring to use it himself because he feels like he is owed the right of leading this world and commanding this world because he's a damn celestial being. So every single one of these wizards that you find out later, they're celestial beings. They're not like mortals that just had like learned magic or something. And that's kind of cool. I mean, it's inferred in this one. It's not actually explicitly stated. But once we lose Gandalf and then the Fellowship gets to Lothlorien and Frodo has that vision, it's sort of a foreshadowing that Gandalf is coming back. He's going to be the White because we've already been told Saruman is no longer Saruman the White. He's Saruman of the Many Colors. And so there is no White Wizard at this point. Another point I found very interesting in this is that Radagast the Brown is in it. I had no idea. And I don't know why I didn't think he would be in it, but I love Radagast. I think he's a great character, and I would never have even known about him because I've never read these books before, except for the Hobbit film, where he goes and helps Gandalf, and they go and attack Sauron and Gul Dulgur and kick him out of Mirkwood. Ultimately, that's another sort of side mission that was explained in this that they then added to the Hobbit trilogy because it did happen at that same time. But it's also why, Gandalf is constantly being taken away. So that whole mission of Radagast coming to Gandalf and saying, hey, dude, Sauron's back. We need to go get him. He's in Mirkwood right now, corrupting the entire forest. Let's go take him out. And so he and everyone went and kicked him out of Mirkwood. And that's when he sort of went over to, Mordor is what it's called. And ultimately, then Gandalf went off to find Gollum, captured him, and then Gollum escaped him. And then he went to Saruman, and Saruman captured him. So Gandalf is just getting his ass kicked left and right, just going on all these side adventures while we're just watching hobbits smoke pipeweed and farm, ostensibly. So there's tons of cool stuff happening behind the scenes that we then learn about, that they then Peter Jackson makes into, part of the films and stuff, which I'm very glad he did and is doing. Because it's the action stuff. But again, Tolkien doesn't like action. He doesn't do it very well. And so it's all off screen. Let's not deal with that. Let's just focus on this a little bit. So and maybe he gets better with action in the next books because we have infinitely more action. But what I was really looking forward to was Moria, Khazad-dûm, and this underground dwarven kingdom that was destroyed because the dwarves got greedy. So this is where it connects with Rings of Power that I did not know. So the Balrog, that demon, fire demon being, in Rings of Power, it shows the dwarves delving down and opening him up, but I didn't know the timeline. And that's the exact timeline that is presented in this. So once they get to Rivendell, there's a huge lore and information dump about the history of dwarves and the history of elves and everything in Middle-earth. And this is a huge part of that. And it's why the dwarves were kicked out of what they called Khazad-dûm and what everyone else calls Moria, was that they delved too deep trying to get Mithril, which was this pristine element, this material they discovered of great wealth that everyone around Middle-earth wanted, but only the dwarves had, and so they wanted to get more of it, obviously. But that released this being that is also just like the wizards. It's like this celestial being, this monster of out of time and space, like the wizards are, and it like completely decimated and destroyed all the dwarves there. And then after the Hobbit book, the dwarves went back in to try to get, reclaim Moria or Khazad-dûm, and the Balrog destroyed them all. And then we cut to the Fellowship of the Ring, and they're forced to go into Moria because the storm on top of the mountain is just too severe. They can't pass it. So they end up going in Moria, and the Balrog attacks again and kicks their asses out. Now, what I was so frustrated with is it has this moment of, I think it was Pippin, who ended up throwing a rock down a well, not knocking down armor down a well. And in the movie, that starts the drum roll, and then all of a sudden the orcs and the trolls come and attack them. That's not how it works in the book at all. In fact, there's very little fighting in the book when they're in Moria. They're discovered because of that incident, but the orcs don't actually come to them until they get into that room and they're reading the book about the second expedition, or actually it would be the first expedition in trying to liberate Moria from the Balrog and the orcs, because they don't know the Balrog's down there. They just know that there was an ancient evil that awoken, but they didn't know it was still there. They find the book saying, they're at the door. We're trapped. We can't go anywhere. And the Fellowship finds out that they're trapped too. So they have this little combat, but it's so quick and done over with that I was surprised that it just like hand waved over the nitty gritty of combat. And then on the other side of it, suddenly Frodo is like hurt. Like, he had that spear that supposedly jabbed into him, but he was wearing that mithril coat that Bilbo gave him, and so he didn't actually get hurt. That was shocking to me, that they just hand waved across all of the combat. And then that was it. Like, the bad guys, the orcs, all left on their own accord, and the heroes just ended up walking to the other side of Moria without any problems at all. And then they finally get to this very last part of crossing this massive bridge, and the orcs then attack again. And Gandalf closes these massive doors, and he's like, you guys go across that bridge to the exit, and I'll just hold them here. Aragorn doesn't really want to. Boromir doesn't really want to, but they end up doing it. And that's where the orcs flee again, and the Balrog shows himself. So Gandalf put this spell on these doors, and the Balrog's power counteracted that spell, and the Balrog burst through Gandalf down the stairs to where the actual heroes were fleeing to the bridge. And they were like, whoa, what happened to you? Never talked about it, didn't explain it until later, but ultimately they get back on the bridge, and that's where the Balrog faces off against Gandalf. Gandalf breaks the thing, and the Balrog and Gandalf fall to their deaths. He says, fly, you fools. They leave bawling, understandably, and that's where the orcs sort of chase them out, and they have to fight through the orcs that are guarding that southern gate. And I actually don't know if it's a southern gate or not, but it's the other gate. And then ultimately they flee off into the wilderness. So these little differences that are the inciting moments of the film are a little bit more boring in the book, because when there is actual combat, it's few and far between, and then it's just like hand waved over really, really quickly. Little disappointing. So Saruman wasn't corrupted by Sauron in the book. I didn't remember that. Interesting. I do wonder if Tolkien's experience during World War I influenced the decision of not wanting to be so detailed in describing fighting scenes. That's an interesting note that I had not considered. Maybe that is why he doesn't like to detail it too much. I don't know. I mean, Saruman you could make an argument that he was corrupted because he wanted to use the ring, and that's what corrupted him, is his desire to use the ring. But there was no like that palantir, that ball that he had, that he covered up and uncovered with Sauron's eye in it. That was not in that scene at all, at least not to my recollection. And if it was, I completely went right over it for some insane reason, which I don't think I would have, because I was, waiting for that scene. But in any case, they end up getting to Rivendell. They end up passing through Moria, and they start heading towards Minas Tirith / what is it called? Mordor. They have to sort of split up there, but first they hit Lothlorien to get away from all the orcs that are following them. And Lothlorien is this ancient home of not just... I know I wrote down the names of these damn people somewhere. Why? Oh, here it is. Galadriel and Lord Celeborn. So it's their sort of home, and they're like some of the oldest elves that had come over and lived in Middle-earth, but even they're going to be leaving soon. And we get that really great moment of Frodo offering the ring to Galadriel, and her saying, I would use it in, trying to be beneficent, and end up being a terror. And she's like, ooh, I survived the temptation and stuff. And then she gifts them all, but they stay in Lothlorien for a long time. And there's this scene in Moria in the film where Gollum is actually following them, and Gandalf has a conversation with Frodo about Gollum, and that they acknowledge that he is in fact following him. That does not happen. And in fact, they don't even know that Gollum is following him until Gollum shows up in Lothlorien. And he's almost captured and attacked by the elves because the orcs make this huge invasion into Lothlorien, and the elves sort of ambush them and take them out. And that's when they saw Gollum. And so Gollum has been evading everyone the whole time, but he's always at their heels, and they only acknowledge it after Lothlorien, which I found a little bit interesting because you always think of Gollum as this pathetic creature, but he's actually crazy smart, crazy driven, and very, very effective at what he does, which is, reclaim his precious and murder people in order to do it. And it doesn't matter who gets in his way. Not even Strider / Aragorn could capture him. That's how sly he was. Or capture him again, I should say. So, pretty cool. Anyway, they get in the boat and then they head off to the Númenórean lands. And ultimately, they get to Amon Hen, and that's where Boromir is talking to Frodo. And he's like, hey, man, look, I know you're sort of at this point where you have to decide whether you go to my home of Minas Tirith or whether you go off to Mordor. But how about you just let us use the ring in Minas Tirith for a while, and then you can take it to Mordor and destroy it. But they're literally attacking my home right now, and we could use that ring to destroy them. So why don't we just do that? And Frodo's just like, no way, dude. And that's where he sort of like, Boromir turns on him all evilly and attacks or reaches out to try to claim the ring. And Frodo, puts the ring on and flees off. He goes up to the summit of Amon Hen, and there's this ancient Númenórean seat there, sort of carved out of granite, or it's naturally a seat out of granite or something. But from that seat, he can see all the way to Gondor and Rohan and Mordor. And then suddenly Sauron's eye turns toward him, and he feels Sauron closing in on him to locate him. And he freaks out. And that's where he's like, I know I have to go to Mordor. I'm going to go alone. And what I expected was Boromir to go back to the friends and then the orcs to attack like it happens in the movie. The orcs don't even show up in this book at the end. It's literally just Samwise Gamgee realizing that Frodo has gone back to the boats. And so he runs over there, and together they get a bunch of supplies and they head off to Moria or Mordor together without the Fellowship. And the Fellowship at this point, maybe at the beginning of the next book, we get that orc battle, but it's not even in this one at all so far. So I don't know what happens from that moment on, but they get over to Amon Law, they pull up to the shores, and they're... Frodo and Sam are on their way to Mordor. And that's kind of where it ends. Very cool book. I really enjoyed the world building and the history because all of it was 100% new to me. I did not know that it was going to be in there. And the films don't ever even talk about it in the depth that the book covers it. And that's really, I think, why you would want to read the book rather than just watch the films. There are small differences all throughout, but the lore and the history is what really pulls you in. And it's what J.R.R. Tolkien really excels at. So if you like that part of a story, you should definitely read The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. And because of that, I gave it 5 out of 5 evil eyes. Look, this is a good book. It is a great fantasy novel. It is incredible with its history and its build. I didn't give The Hobbit this good of a score. I thought The Hobbit was way overrated, and it was way too kiddie of a story. This is a much more adult story, and it's much more targeted toward adults with a sensibility of really appreciating the history and the culture of elves and everything. It goes way into a lot of depth about dwarves, elves, and a lot more about hobbits. And I think most of the Hobbit stuff was actually duplicated from The Hobbit. But, I guess he didn't figure everyone would have read The Hobbit or something because it didn't do very well in his time. So he wanted to give you all that extra information in this. But in either case, I think it's definitely worth a read. This is one of those books, or one of those trilogies of books, that it should be required reading for everyone in school. Like I read The Great Gatsby and The Scarlet Letter, both amazing novels, and I still reread them to this day because I love them because of how impactful they are. This series is one of those that I think should be among those where it's an impactful book. It is inspired and driven just tons of media, whether it's from films to TV series to games, I mean, all across the board, it has influenced culture in a way that not many books ever do. So for that reason alone, you should definitely read it. If you're an aspiring writer, you should absolutely read this. If you're a storyteller of any sort, you should definitely read this. Do yourselves a favor. All right. So, what I liked most about this book was the history. What I liked least about this book was the lack of detail in combat, but it's totally worth it. Were there any scenes in the book that you really wish were included in Peter Jackson's movie? No, I have the extended versions, and it would have just made them so much longer. And the lore dumps are not as important to the movies as they are to the books. And so I felt like he did a really good job of editing the content and adding excitement and adventure to what, in a lot of cases, is just boring travel that you get in the book, like really long and boring travel. So you can get away with that in a book. You cannot get away with that in the movie. So I think Peter Jackson did a brilliant job of editing this book down into a really wonderful film. But again, you have to see the extended versions because the original theatrical cut, I just don't think is worth it. When you can get those extra time in, it's definitely worth it. All right. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, like it or not, evil spelled backwards is live. So get out there and be evil.